What if the man you leaned on in the dark, the stranger who let you sleep, who watched over you without saying a word, turned out to be the person with the power to rebuild everything you lost? What if he already knew your name before you ever said it? Nadia Fleming boarded that flight with nothing left to lose. 31 years old, brilliant in ways that should have protected her, and completely broken in ways she hadn't admitted yet. She wasn't supposed to meet anyone on that plane. She was supposed to disappear into sleep and wake up in a life that didn't hurt so much. She didn't expect the shoulder. She didn't expect the warmth. And she absolutely did not expect what she would find when she walked through the glass doors of Shin Global Technologies on her very first morning in Seoul. This is a story about what happens when the world takes everything from you, and then, without asking permission, hands it all back wearing a different face. If you've ever started over with shaking hands and a brave heart, this story is for you. Subscribe so you never miss a new chapter, and drop a comment below. Have you ever met someone in the most unexpected place who changed everything? Tell me. I'm reading every single one. The gate at JFK was loud in the particular way that international terminals are loud, a specific brand of chaos that belongs to people who are going somewhere far and carrying too much. Rolling suitcases, children, the crinkle of boarding passes being folded and unfolded by anxious hands. Nadia stood at the edge of the boarding queue with one carry-on, one checked bag, and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from exhaustion so deep it has become its own silence. She was 31. She had been 31 for exactly 4 months, and for 3 of those 4 months, she had been living in the aftermath of the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She didn't let herself think the whole story again. She had replayed it so many times that the edges had worn smooth, like sea glass. Brennan, the code, the company that had been hers, then both of theirs, then, overnight, legally, irreversibly, only his. 4 years of her life in a product she had built line by line, late nights and cold coffee, and the particular satisfaction of watching something abstract become real. Gone. Not stolen in the dramatic sense that movies use, no ski masks, no broken locks. Gone in the clean, suffocating way that happens when someone you trusted has a better lawyer and has been planning longer. She had fought. Of course she had. But by the time she understood what Brennan had done, the paperwork was airtight, and her savings were not. The settlement she'd accepted was humiliating. The NDA she'd signed in exchange for it was suffocating. And the startup she'd built from a sketch on a coffee shop napkin in 2019 was now worth $12 million with her name nowhere on it. So when her best friend Zara had called in October and said, quietly, carefully, that she knew of a position in Seoul, a senior engineering role at one of the most respected tech conglomerates in Asia, Nadia had said yes before Zara had finished the sentence. She needed to go somewhere no one knew what had happened to her. Somewhere she could be a programmer again, not a cautionary tale. Seoul was 12 hours away. That felt exactly right. The boarding announcement came, and she moved with the crowd, head down, earbuds in though nothing was playing. She found her seat, 34B, middle seat in economy, which she'd known about and accepted with the grim pragmatism of someone who'd stopped expecting things to go her way, and settled in. The window seat was already occupied. She registered this peripherally, the way you register weather. She put her bag in the overhead bin, sat down, and clicked her seatbelt without looking left or right. The aisle seat remained empty for another 20 minutes. Then the last boarding passengers trickled through, and a man stopped at her row, checked his boarding pass with something that looked very much like disbelief, and sat down. He was Korean. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was that he was sitting in economy, the way a person sits when they have spent very little time in economy. Not uncomfortably, not rudely, but with the faint quality of someone recalibrating. His posture was correct in the way that suggested it was always correct. His suit was not the kind of suit people wore on overnight flights, and there was a phone call he ended almost the moment he sat down, a brief, clipped sentence in Korean that communicated, even without translation, the energy of someone telling an assistant to handle something. Nadia noticed none of this consciously. She was already tilting toward sleep. The plane pushed back. The safety video played. The lights dimmed. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Nadia Fleming fell asleep. She fell asleep the way the truly exhausted fall asleep, completely, without ceremony, between one breath and the next. And sometime in those dark hours above the ocean, her head found the shoulder beside her. She didn't know this. She was deeply, dreamlessly unconscious. Woo Seok-shin knew it immediately. He felt the weight shift, slow and unconscious, and he went very still. His first instinct was to wake her, a gentle adjustment, the polite thing. He turned his head slightly, and then he stopped. She looked exhausted, even in sleep. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day, the kind that comes from a long time. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes that no single night had made. Her hands were loose in her lap, finally unclenched, and there was something about that specific looseness, the surrender of it, that made him set his phone down. He was Woo Seok-shin, chairman of Shin Global Technologies. 34 years old, though he had felt 40 for most of the last decade. He had not flown economy since he was 22 and still in graduate school at MIT. And he would not be flying it now if a ticketing system error, an overbooked first class, and a staffing crisis in his own aviation management team hadn't converged into tonight's particular humiliation. He had been furious about it for approximately 40 minutes. And then the woman in 34B had fallen asleep on his shoulder, and something strange had happened to his fury. It dissolved. That was the only word for it. It simply dissolved, the way morning dissolves a dream, not gone exactly, just no longer present in the same way. No one had ever looked at him and not known who he was. Not in years. No one had touched him without intention. No one had leaned on him simply because they needed to, without calculation, without awareness of what leaning on Woo Seok-shin might gain them. This woman was leaning on him because she was tired. That was all. That was everything. He sat very still for 11 hours. He read nothing. He watched nothing. Once, a flight attendant passed and gave him a questioning look, and he met it with an expression that communicated, clearly and completely, that this was not a situation requiring intervention. The flight attendant moved on. Somewhere over Russia, a thought arrived, quiet and uninvited. I feel human right now. It surprised him enough that it came again. Human. Not powerful. Not feared. Not the chairman. Just a man on a plane, being leaned on by a stranger who needed somewhere to rest. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she was going. He knew only that her hands had been clenched when she sat down and were open now, and that something about that felt important, in a way he could not explain, and would not have admitted to anyone. When the descent into Incheon began and the cabin lights came up, she stirred. He watched her come back to herself. The small frown, the slow blink, the moment of disorientation. He watched the exact instant she understood where she was, what she'd done, whose shoulder she had slept on for the better part of the flight. The look on her face was spectacular. Mortification, complete and total, arriving in waves. She pulled herself upright so fast she nearly hit the seat in front of her. He had been composed his entire adult life. He had sat across from heads of state without blinking. He had not smiled genuinely at something unexpected in longer than he could remember. He smiled now. Oh my God, I am so sorry. I never do this, I swear I don't. The apology came out in a rush, her hands pressing briefly to her face, and the total absence of performance in her embarrassment made the smile stay. It's fine. It is absolutely not fine. I slept on a stranger for 12 hours. 11. We're landing in 40 minutes. She stared at him. He kept his face neutral, though it required something. That is not better. I know. A beat. She looked at him like she was trying to determine if he was angry and finding no evidence of it, which seemed to confuse her further. "I'm Nadia." The name came out like the minimum dignity the situation required. "Woo Siok." She nodded. He nodded. The landing gear deployed beneath them with a heavy mechanical groan. "Are you going to Seoul for work?" "Yes. A new job." She paused, and the next two words carried something heavier than their syllables. "Fresh start." He let those words sit for a moment before answering. "Welcome to Seoul." She almost smiled. Almost. They didn't exchange numbers. They didn't say goodbye in the terminal. The crowd separated them before they reached the gate, and Nadia moved quickly, head down, the way people do when they are hoping the universe will allow them to pretend something embarrassing never happened. Woo-seok watched her disappear into the terminal. Then he took out his phone and called his assistant. He had a meeting at Shin Global in 14 hours. He had a company to run. He had entirely too much to do to be standing in an arrivals terminal, thinking about a woman whose last name he didn't know. He thought about her anyway. Shin Global Technologies occupied the top 12 floors of a building in Gangnam that had been designed to look, at certain angles, like it was cutting the sky in half. Nadia stood on the pavement outside it on a Tuesday morning in November, her laptop bag on her shoulder and her stomach doing something that was not quite nerves and not quite excitement but lived in the neighborhood of both. She had arrived in Seoul 4 days earlier. She had slept 12 hours, eaten ramen she bought from a convenience store at midnight because the grocery delivery app confused her, and spent 2 days doing nothing but walking the city until she was tired enough to stop thinking about Brennan. It had worked. Mostly. Seoul was large and loud, and indifferent to her history in a way that felt like mercy. Zara had texted from New York. Day 1. "You've got this." Nadia had sent back a single thumbs up because she didn't trust herself to say more. The lobby of Shin Global was everything the building promised from the outside. High ceilings, polished floors, the specific temperature of a place that takes itself seriously. A young woman at the reception desk smiled the practiced smile of someone who greeted executives all day and handed Nadia a visitor badge and a folder of onboarding documents and directed her to the 14th floor, where the engineering department's orientation would begin. Nadia rode the elevator with 2 other new hires, a quiet man named Dae-ho who specialized in cloud infrastructure, and a woman named Ji-yeon who was joining the product team and who made easy conversation in excellent English. Nadia was grateful for Ji-yeon. She was less grateful for how awake Ji-yeon seemed at 8:45 in the morning. The orientation was thorough. An HR team member walked them through benefits, protocols, confidentiality agreements. The last one made Nadia's pen hesitate for exactly 1 second before she signed. She was familiar with what confidentiality agreements could contain. She read this one carefully enough that the HR woman tilted her head slightly, and Nadia looked up and answered the unspoken question plainly. She always read what she signed. The HR woman nodded as if that were unusual, which told Nadia something about how most people arrived here. At 10:30, they were told there would be a brief welcome meeting with senior leadership. Standard. Introductory. Nadia gathered her folder and followed the group down the corridor toward the large glass-walled conference room at the end. She was looking at her phone. She was almost through the door before she looked up. There were 4 people already in the room, 3 she didn't know, and 1 she did. Standing at the head of the table. Suit different from the plane but carrying it the same way. The same quality of stillness, the same composure that she had, in her exhaustion, attributed to general Korean businessman energy and not thought further about. He saw her at the same moment she saw him, and then, in front of the 3 executives, in front of the HR team member, in front of Dae-ho and Ji-yeon, his mouth curved, slow and deliberate, into the same expression she remembered from the moment she'd lifted her head from his shoulder at 35,000 feet. "Good morning." His voice addressed the room, composed and even. "Welcome to Shin Global." And then, just briefly, his eyes moved back to hers. "I hope everyone is well rested after their journeys." The heat arrived in Nadia's face with the force and inconvenience of a natural disaster. She spent the next 20 minutes staring at the conference table and understanding, in real time, that the man whose shoulder she had slept on was Woo Seok Shin, chairman of this company that she now worked for. This was a great deal of information to process while someone was speaking about Q4 projections. The meeting ended. The executives filtered out. The new hires were directed back to HR. Nadia was almost at the door when his voice came from behind her, quiet, even, carrying just far enough. "Ms. Fleming." She stopped. She turned. He was standing near the window, hands in his pockets, and he looked composed in the infuriating way of someone who has never in his life slept on a stranger on a plane and therefore has nothing to be embarrassed about. She lifted her chin. "Mr. Shin, Woo Seok. I don't think that's appropriate, given that you are, apparently, my employer. And yet you slept on me for 11 hours. She held his gaze. He held hers. This was going to be, she understood with crystalline clarity, a problem. I'd like to pretend that didn't happen. You're welcome to try. Are you going to make it difficult? Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, not quite warmth, but something that lived between them. I haven't decided. She left before he could say anything else. But she was aware, in a way she hadn't been aware of anything in 3 months, that she was not thinking about Brennan. Shin Global's engineering division was working on a problem that had stalled their most important product for 6 weeks. Nadia understood this from the technical briefing she received on day 3. The product was an AI-integrated compliance platform designed for Korean financial institutions. Elegant in concept, efficient in theory, and currently producing errors in its real-time data processing module that the existing team had been unable to isolate. The errors were subtle. They didn't crash the system. They introduced small, irregular inconsistencies in the data outputs, the kind that wouldn't be caught until an auditor looked closely, at which point the damage would be severe. The team had been looking at this problem since September. It was now November. Nadia looked at it for 4 days. On the 5th day, she wrote a 14-page technical memo and sent it to her direct supervisor, a senior engineer named Min-jun, who had initially received her with the polite skepticism of someone who had watched other hotshot hires fail to deliver. Min-jun read the memo. He read it again. He forwarded it, with a single line of commentary, to the CTO. By the following Monday, Nadia was in a different meeting room, smaller, higher floor, fewer people, presenting her findings to 3 people who were paid to be difficult to impress. She was not nervous. This was the only place she was not nervous. Code was the language in which she had always been fluent, the one that had never betrayed her, the one where what she built stayed built until someone deliberately tore it down. She spoke clearly and precisely, and did not minimize her conclusions because the room was more senior than she was. Woo Seok was not in this meeting. She was aware of his absence the way you are aware of a sound that has stopped, not loudly, but undeniably. By the end of the week, her proposed solution was approved for implementation. Min-jun delivered the verdict with slightly less skepticism than before. The standard timeline to deploy was 6 weeks. Nadia pushed back without flinching. She could do it in 4. Min-jun's expression said he'd believe it when he saw it. She did it in 3.5. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that she hadn't felt in years. The rhythm of work that matters, of problems worth solving, of days that ended with exhaustion that felt earned rather than inflicted. She arrived early. She left late. She ate lunch at her desk more often than was probably wise and learned to drink her coffee Korean style, which was sweeter than she was used to and somehow still necessary. She made 2 friends, Ji-yeon, who had been warm from day 1 and proved to be genuinely funny and deeply knowledgeable about where to eat in Gangnam, and a back-end engineer named Soo-bin, who communicated primarily in code comments and dry humor, and who seemed to respect Nadia for identifying the bug faster than anyone else had. In Seoul's social landscape, Nadia was learning respect was its own dialect of warmth. She saw Woo-seok twice in those weeks. Once in the elevator, 6 seconds, no words exchanged, the specific silent acknowledgement of two people who are pretending not to be thinking about each other. Once in the lobby as she was leaving and he was arriving, surrounded by 3 people who were clearly waiting to speak to him the moment he had attention to spare. Their eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He nodded. She nodded. She walked through the revolving door and out into the Seoul evening and did not look back, which was an act of discipline she was quietly proud of. She was not looking to feel things for anyone. She had trusted someone with her work, her future, the product of her most creative years, and he had taken all of it and handed her a settlement offer in a conference room with bad lighting. The lesson was clear. The lesson had been written on her with indelible ink. And yet, there was a man in this building whose shoulder she had slept on, who had let her, who had sat still for 11 hours rather than disturb her, and who had said good morning to a conference room full of people and let the words land on her specifically, like something meant. And she was trying very hard to feel nothing about that. She was not entirely succeeding. Woo-seok did not seek her out. This was a decision he made deliberately on the morning after the welcome meeting, when he sat with his coffee at 6 a.m. and had the honest conversation with himself that his position required. She was an employee. She was new. She had come here for a fresh start. Those were her words, and they carried weight. And whatever had happened on that plane was a private thing, a quiet thing, the kind of accidental intimacy that only exists because no one intended it. To press it, to make it into something she would have to navigate on top of a new country, a new company, a new life, that was not something he was willing to do. So he kept his distance, professionally, correctly. He reviewed her work through the chain of command like he reviewed everyone else's work. When her memo on the compliance platform reached him through the CTO, he read it twice and felt something he recognized as pride, which was inconvenient and interesting. The problem was that keeping distance from Nadia Fleming required effort, and Woo-seok was not accustomed to effort in this particular direction. He was accustomed to effort in the direction of acquisition, of strategy, of growth. The effort of not thinking about someone was a different muscle entirely, and he was using it constantly. He thought about the way she had said fresh start. He thought about the specific quality of her stillness in the elevator. Composed, but not cold. Guarded, but not hostile. He thought about the moment in the conference room, when she'd lifted her chin and called him Mr. Shin, and he had understood, without being told, that she was someone who had learned to protect herself the hard way. He had not survived the Korean business world without being able to read people. He read her as someone who had been burned by trust. He read her as someone who was here because she needed to rebuild something that had been taken. He wanted to know what. He wanted to know by whom. He kept his distance instead. It was Ji-yeon who told him. Accidentally, 2 weeks before December. She was not speaking to him. She was speaking to Subin in the kitchen 2 floors below his office, and he was passing the open door with a document he'd come down personally to collect. A habit his assistant found unnecessary and that he maintained because moving through the building occasionally reminded him that 1,100 people worked here and that they were not abstractions. He didn't intend to hear. He heard anyway. She built the whole thing herself, Ji-yeon was saying, and her tone had the specific heat of someone relaying an injustice. From scratch. 4 years. And then her co-founder just took it. All of it. She showed me the original code on her personal drive once. The final product looks almost exactly like what she built. He just filed it under his name. A pause. The sound of a coffee machine. That's why she's here. Subin's voice, flat and precise. She had nothing left in New York. Everything she'd built was gone. Her friend knew someone in our HR department and put in a word. Woo-seok continued down the corridor. He did not look back through the open door. He did not accelerate his pace. He arrived at his office. He sat down. He looked at the Seoul skyline for a long time. So that was what fresh start meant. He did not interfere. It was not his place. But he found himself, in the following days, paying a different kind of attention, not to her proximity, but to the quality of her footing here, to whether the ground beneath her was solid. He made sure, through channels quiet enough to be invisible, that her project resources were adequate, that her access to the systems she needed was not slowed by bureaucratic lag, that Minjun's performance notes, when they passed through his review cycle, accurately reflected what she was contributing. He could not give back what had been taken from her. He could make sure this place was what it was supposed to be, a beginning, not another trap. That was the most he allowed himself. It did not feel like enough. It was a Tuesday in December, 3 weeks before Christmas, and the lobby of Shin Global was dressed for the season in a way that managed to be tasteful without being cold. Nadia had learned to appreciate this about Seoul, the way it committed to things without overcrowding them. She was leaving later than usual. The Phase 2 implementation of the compliance platform had hit a timing issue she'd spent 4 hours resolving, and by the time she closed her laptop and rode the elevator down and walked through the lobby, it was past 8 in the evening, and the building was mostly emptied of the daytime crowd. She was recording a voice memo for Zara. They had moved from texts to voice messages somewhere around week 3, when the time difference made real calls complicated, and the voice memos felt more like the kitchen table conversations they'd always had, and she was almost at the revolving door when she heard it. A voice she recognized before she turned around. Not because she'd heard it often, because the specific register of it, the particular self-certainty of it, was woven into some of the worst memories she owned. Nadia. She turned. Brennan Walsh was standing 10 feet away in the Shin Global lobby. He was wearing the good coat, the one he'd bought to impress people. And he was smiling the smile that she now understood had always been an instrument rather than an expression. For 3 full seconds, Nadia Fleming did not move. Then she did the most controlled thing she had ever done in her life. She breathed. She put her phone in her coat pocket. She did not let her face show the earthquake happening inside her chest. Brennan. Small world. He spread his hands in the gesture she remembered, the one that looked like openness and was actually performance. I had no idea you were here. I'm in Seoul for a partnership meeting. We've been in talks with Shin Global for a month. He let a beat pass. How are you? There were about 40 different things she wanted to say to him. She had rehearsed several of them in the shower, in her worst months. None of them came out. I'm well. Her voice was level. That was the victory she would allow herself. Good. That's really good, Nadia. I always hoped. Brennan. His name, in her mouth, landed the way she meant it to. Quiet, final, like a door being closed rather than slammed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I have somewhere to be. She walked past him. She pushed through the revolving door. The night air of Seoul hit her like cold water, and she kept walking, 1 foot and then the next, until she reached the corner where the light was red, and she had no choice but to stop. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them. She breathed. She had not crumbled. She had not said anything she would regret. She had walked past 3 years of damage in a lobby and come out the other side. She pressed her back against the building wall and let herself shake for exactly 90 seconds, because that felt like the right amount of time. And then she straightened and did what she always did when the world tilted. She called Zara. The phone rang twice. He's here. Her voice was low and steady. In Seoul. At my company. Zara said several things in quick succession that were heartfelt and anatomically creative. Nadia laughed, the first real laugh she'd had in days, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since the lobby. I walked past him, Nadia continued. I didn't fall apart. Of course you didn't. Zara's voice softened into something fiercer. You're not who you were when he did what he did. You know that, right? Nadia leaned against the cold wall and looked up at the Seoul sky, narrow between the buildings, pinched with stars she was only just learning to find. I'm starting to... Her voice was barely above a whisper. She did not know that the revolving door had turned again 30 seconds after she walked through it. She did not know that Woo-seok had been crossing the lobby from the elevator bank on his way to a car waiting outside and had stopped. She did not know he had seen the whole thing. Woo-seok spent that night doing something he almost never did, making decisions based on something other than strategy. He knew about the partnership talks with Walsh Ventures. They had been in his calendar as a low-priority review. Sustainable infrastructure was not Shin Global's core business, and the partnership, if it happened, would live in a subsidiary. He had not been scheduled to attend the Tuesday meeting. He had not known that Brennan Walsh was in his building until he crossed the lobby and saw Nadia's face at the moment Walsh said her name. He had seen enough in those 10 seconds to understand the shape of the damage. The particular way she had gone very still before she moved. The quality of her voice when his name came back from her, not with anger, which would have been easier, but with the controlled quiet of someone who had decided long ago that their pain would not be entertainment for the person who caused it. She had walked past him with her head up. Woo-seok had stood at the edge of the lobby and watched her do it, and he had felt something fierce and wordless that he did not examine too closely because he was not sure what to do with it. He called his head of business development at 10 that night. The Walsh Ventures talks. He kept his voice even. I want a full review of the proposed partnership on my desk by Thursday. Not a summary. Everything. The review arrived Thursday. He read it Friday. The partnership was a mid-range financial deal. Not transformative, not essential. Walsh Ventures brought some useful infrastructure contacts and very little else of distinction. It would have been a reasonable, unremarkable agreement. He archived it. He sent a brief note to his business development head, pursuing other directions for the infrastructure vertical. Thank the Walsh team for their time. This was not about Nadia. He would not have told himself it was. Walsh Ventures did not bring enough to the table to justify a partnership with a firm he had no particular confidence in. That assessment was independent of everything else, and it happened to be true. He sent the note. He moved on. The Friday after that, he did something he had not planned. He was reviewing the engineering department's quarterly output report, a routine review that typically lasted 20 minutes, and he found himself stopping at the section on the compliance platform. The implementation was ahead of schedule. The error rate since Nadia's fix had been deployed was 0. The client satisfaction notes from the financial institutions piloting the platform were, in the language of formal reports, extremely positive, which meant they were in fact enthusiastic. He closed the report. He walked to his window. He thought about a woman who had built something from scratch for 4 years and had it taken, who had come to a country where she knew almost no one and solved in weeks a problem that had stalled a team for months, who had walked past the man who destroyed her with her head up and her voice steady. He took out his phone. He typed a message to Minjun. Please pass along my personal commendation to Mr. Fleming for the compliance platform work. The quality of the solution reflects well on the entire team. He set the phone down. Then he picked it up again. And please let her know I'd like to meet briefly next week. Informal, no agenda, 15 minutes, whenever works for her. He set the phone on his desk. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a man doing something uncertain. The sensation was not entirely unwelcome. Minjun relayed the message with the careful neutrality of an experienced professional who understood that a chairman requesting an informal one-on-one with a new hire was unusual and that this information was not his to editorialize. Nadia read the message twice. Then a third time. Then she closed her laptop, walked to the window of the engineering floor, and had a very brief, very silent conversation with herself about what this meant and whether she was going to let it matter. She told Minjun Thursday morning worked. She did not ask why. She did not call Zara about it, because Zara would have 18 opinions and Nadia needed to arrive at this particular meeting without 18 opinions in her head. The meeting was on the 41st floor, not the executive suite, which was 43 and 44. but a smaller room with a long view and a round table. Round tables didn't have a head. She noted this the way she noted everything. He was already there when she arrived, 3 minutes early, which meant he had been there longer. There was coffee on the table, and a small plate of something she didn't recognize, and the view of Seoul in December, which was a city in the process of wearing frost for the first time this season. Ms. Fleming. Mr. Shin. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but in the same family. You're still doing that. You're still my employer. I own the company. There are 4 levels of management between us. Sit down, Nadia. Her name in his mouth. Just like that. Not formal, not careful. Did something she was not prepared for. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup because it was warm, and because having something to do with her hands was useful. I wanted to tell you personally. His voice was even unhurried. The compliance platform work. It was exceptional. Thank you. I don't say that to everyone. I know. She met his eyes. I did the same work in New York. No one said it there either. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity. She would have left the room if it had been pity. Something more like acknowledgement. The recognition of a fact without the requirement to make it smaller or larger than it was. I know something about what happened to you in New York. His tone was careful. Clean. Not everything. I didn't look for it. I overheard enough to understand. She went very still. Not the frozen stillness of shock, the deliberate stillness of someone deciding how to receive something. And nothing. It's yours. I'm not going to ask about it or use it. I wanted you to know I'm aware of it because I think you came here expecting to have to hide it. And you don't. Not here. The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. You ended the partnership talks with Walsh Ventures. It wasn't a question. He picked up his coffee. He took a moment. Walsh Ventures didn't present a compelling enough value proposition. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city glittered behind him, indifferent and beautiful. Woo-seok. He went very still, not unlike the way he'd gone still on the plane. Thank you. He nodded, once. The coffee is getting cold. She laughed, small and real and surprising to both of them. She picked up her cup, and they sat in the enormous view of Seoul and drank their coffee. And it was 15 minutes that became 45, and neither of them mentioned it. December in Seoul had a specific quality of cold that Nadia had not encountered anywhere else. Clean and sharp, without the wet heaviness of New York winters, the kind of cold that felt clarifying rather than oppressive. She had started walking to work when the weather permitted, a 40-minute route that took her through a neighborhood she was learning street by street, the way you learn a language, slowly, then suddenly. She had been here 6 weeks. She knew the ramen place where the broth came out in a depth that made you understand why people crossed the city for it. She knew that Ji-yeon's recommendation system was almost pathologically reliable. She knew that Subin's silence, which she'd initially read as coldness, was actually the specific warmth of someone who didn't waste words. She knew that Woo-seok Shin took the stairs instead of the elevator when he had something to think through. She knew this because she'd started doing the same thing, and they had passed each other on the stairwell between floors 38 and 39 on a Wednesday afternoon. He had glanced at her and said one word, stairs person, and she had said sometimes. And they had both continued in their respective directions, and she'd arrived at her floor in a state that was not consistent with the temperature of the stairwell. After the coffee meeting, something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the way of romantic comedies, where the shift announces itself with music and rain. Quietly. The way good code shifts when you find the right architecture. Everything suddenly running a little more smoothly. A little less friction in the system. He texted her on a Saturday. She knew it was from his personal number and not a company line because the message read, There is a market near Insadong that sells the best hotdog I've found in Seoul. If you haven't been, not a question, just information offered. She stared at her phone for a long time. Then she typed, I haven't been. And then, because she was not someone who played games with herself or other people. Are you inviting me or informing me? A minute passed. Then, both. She went. He was already there when she arrived. A man of early arrivals, she was learning. Standing in front of a small stall with his hands in his pockets and his breath making small clouds in the December air. And he looked, in that moment, so entirely like a person, rather than a chairman that something in her chest did a thing she'd been trying to prevent it from doing for 6 weeks. They walked for 2 hours. They ate hotdog from paper bags and she burned her tongue on the first one because she was impatient, and he handed her his without a word, his still slightly cooled, and the small domesticity of the gesture landed on her like a stone dropped into still water. He told her about the company, not the public narrative, not the press release version, but the real story. His grandfather's small electronics repair shop in Busan, his father's expansion of it into a regional chain, the decade Woo Seok had spent building it into what it was now. The weight of that inheritance. The way ambition and obligation can occupy the same body without ever becoming comfortable with each other. She told him about the code she'd written when she was 23, in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, with one window and a second-hand desk. The way the idea had arrived almost fully formed, and she'd spent 4 years making it real. What it had felt like to see it in someone else's hands. She did not cry, but her voice went quiet in a particular way, and he listened with the complete attention of someone who understands that some things you can only say once and need them to be heard the first time. When they reached the point where the market path ended and the ordinary street began, they stopped. It was past 5, and the early dark of Seoul winter had settled in, and the streetlights were doing what streetlights do in cold weather, making everything look a little like a photograph. I should go. Yes. Neither of them moved for a moment. Woo Seok. The name came out without the armor now, without the careful distance she'd built around it. He looked at her. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. She didn't look away from him. I'm not built for trusting people right now. I want you to know that going in. It's not about you. It's just where I am. The honesty of it sat between them, clean and undefended. I know. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me be consistent. Those are different things. She thought about the plane, the coffee, the market, the way he'd sat still for 11 hours because disturbing her had seemed like the wrong thing to do. Okay. Just that. Just okay. It was the most she could give, and she gave it entirely. He nodded. Once, and his expression had in it something that was not quite a smile, but was quieter and more certain than one. They said goodnight. She walked home. She did not call Zara until she was inside, and had her coat off, and was sitting on the floor of her apartment, for no reason other than that the floor felt solid. Zara. The phone had barely rung. What happened? I think I'm in trouble. Good trouble or bad trouble. She thought about the hot talk, the stairwell, the way he'd said, I'm asking you to let me be consistent. Good. I think good. Zara was quiet for a beat, the quiet of someone choosing her words, which was unusual enough for Zara that Nadia waited. You deserve good trouble, Zara finally said. You've been in the bad kind long enough. Nadia sat on the floor of her Seoul apartment and pressed her back against the couch and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the person she was becoming might be someone she'd actually like. She should have known he wouldn't leave it alone. Brennan Walsh had never been good at accepting closed doors. It was, in retrospect, one of the things she'd misread as determination when she'd known him first. The refusal to take no for an answer that in a startup context looked like grit and in a lobby in Seoul looked like something else entirely. He reached her by email, professional email, Shin Global address, which meant he had looked her up after the lobby encounter. The message was brief and carefully worded in the way of someone who had thought about it. He was still in Seoul for a few days. He hoped there were no hard feelings. He'd always respected her work. He wondered if she'd be open to a conversation. Nadia read it at 7 a.m. with her first coffee. She read it again. She felt something she identified carefully. Not fear, not anger. Something closer to exhaustion. The specific tiredness that comes from having to deal with something you thought you were finished with. She forwarded it to Zara with no message. Zara responded in 3 seconds with a string of capitalized words. Nadia smiled, put her phone down, and went to work. She did not respond to Brennan. He sent a second message 4 days later. This one was less careful. The veneer of professionalism had thinned enough to show what was underneath. He'd heard she was doing well at Shin Global. He thought that was great. He wanted to catch up. And this was the part that made her set her coffee down very deliberately. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had some information about her time at their joint company that he thought she might want to discuss before it became relevant to her current employer. There it was. She sat with it for 10 minutes. She understood exactly what it was. Not a threat, technically, careful enough to be deniable, but the meaning was clear. He had something, or claimed to have something, and he was holding it over a conversation she hadn't agreed to have. She thought about the NDA she'd signed. She thought about what it covered and what it didn't. She thought about the original code still on her personal drive, time-stamped 2019, which predated everything Brennan had ever filed. She thought about 4 years. Then she picked up her phone and called Woo Seok. He picked up on the second ring. Brennan Walsh emailed me. Her voice was steady. I think he's trying to leverage something. I don't know what he has, if he has anything. But I wanted you to know before anything else happened. A brief silence. Not the silence of someone caught off guard. The silence of someone thinking precisely. Forward me both emails. Don't respond to him. Woo Seok. I don't want you to fight my battles. I'm not going to fight your battle. A pause. Measured. I'm going to make sure it's fought on the right ground. Send me the emails. She sent them. What happened next happened quietly, in the way that things involving lawyers and documented records happen quietly when one party has significantly better lawyers than the other. Woo Seok's legal team reviewed both emails and identified the second as meeting the threshold for implied coercion. They communicated this assessment through formal channels to Walsh Ventures' legal representation. They also noted that Shin Global had conducted its own due diligence on Nadia Fleming's work history and had no concerns to address. Brennan Walsh left Seoul 48 hours later. His departure was unremarkable. No confrontation, no dramatic final scene. He simply ceased to be present, the way a problem disappears when the conditions that sustained it are removed. Nadia learned about this not from Woo Seok, but from a brief, professional summary from Shin Global's legal department, informing her that a matter related to a former professional associate had been resolved and that no further action was required on her part. She read it twice. Then she walked to the stairwell between floors 38 and 39, because it was empty and quiet, and the view from the window halfway up was a narrow slice of Seoul sky, and she stood there for a few minutes and let herself feel it. Not relief exactly. Something larger than relief. The specific feeling of a weight you have been carrying so long you stop noticing it. Lifting. She texted him, "Thank you." His reply came in under a minute. "Hot talk." Saturday. She laughed in the stairwell, alone, with the Seoul sky in her narrow window. "Yes," she typed. And then, before she could second-guess it, "I'll be early this time." His reply, "I'll believe it when I see it." She was still smiling when she pushed back through the stairwell door. January arrived with the particular crispness of a city that wears winter well, and Nadia arrived with it into something she hadn't planned for and hadn't known she still had room for. It wasn't a fairy tale. She wanted to be clear with herself about that, because she'd been in enough situations she'd romanticized past their actual shape. It was two people who had found each other in unusual circumstances, who were navigating the complications of those circumstances with honesty, who had decided, separately and then together, that the complications were worth it. He took her to Bukchan Hanak village on a Sunday morning, when the streets were still quiet and the wooden eaves were edged with frost. The story came out of him slowly, the way private things do. The first time he'd come here, age 8, with his grandfather, who had pressed into him the idea that a person who didn't know where they came from would have trouble knowing where they were going. Nadia listened, and the listening opened something in her own chest. Her grandmother's kitchen in Atlanta. The smell of it. The particular safety of a place where no one needed anything from her. She let that story out too. He received it the way he received everything she offered, complete, unhurried. She showed him the code, the real code. On her laptop, the timestamp visible on the original files, 2019. Years before Brennan had filed anything, he looked at it for a long time. You could still do something with this. The NDA. NDAs cover specific things, not everything. His eyes moved from the screen to her face. I'm not telling you what to do with it. I'm telling you it's not gone. You built something real that doesn't disappear because someone else put their name on it. She thought about this for several days. In February, she found Min Jun at his desk before the morning briefing and put a direct question to him. Did he know an intellectual property attorney she could consult privately? Not at Woo-Sok's prompting, not through any back channel. She was ready, and the reaching out was hers. Min Jun, who had stopped being skeptical of her around week 4, made a call that afternoon. The attorney was precise and careful, and opened a door Nadia had believed was permanently shut. The NDA, it turned out, covered the original company's trade secrets, not prior independent work she had created before their partnership began. The time-stamped files predated the partnership agreement by 8 months. That distinction mattered. That distinction, in fact, was the whole thing. She didn't file anything that week. She gave herself the gift of sitting with the possibility first, of understanding that the option existed before deciding what to do with it. But she called Zara that evening with something in her voice that Zara had not heard in a long time. It's not over, Nadia said. The legal thing. It's not as closed as he made it seem. Zara's silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. I have been waiting, Zara said slowly, for this phone call. For a year. Tell me everything. They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, something that had lived in Nadia's chest like a stone had shifted into something that felt more like a door. Not yet open, but no longer sealed. Woo-Sok did not push. He also did not pretend to be without feeling, which was something she had expected from him, based on every previous experience with professional men who used composure as a shield. His composure, she was learning, was not a shield. It was just how he was made, steady rather than guarded, private rather than closed. He told her once, plainly, on a Saturday evening in February. They were in his kitchen, a room she was getting to know, which meant something, and she was attempting a jollof rice recipe she'd gotten from her mother, and he was monitoring the timer because she had a tendency to lose track of time when she was cooking. He set the timer. Then he turned and looked at her with the directness that, she had learned, meant he was about to say something real. You know that I'm in this. Not because anything has been decided. Just so you have the information. She stirred the pot. She thought about the plane, the shoulder, the 11 hours of stillness. I know. Do you? She looked at him over her shoulder. I've known since the stairwell. Something moved across his face. The full version of his smile. The one she'd learned was rare and had started to feel like a specific kind of wealth. The stairwell. That's what did it. Stairs person. She dropped her voice into her best impression of his cadence, flat and unhurried. He laughed. In the kitchen of his apartment in Seoul, watching her cook with the confidence of someone who had decided to be at home in this life she was building, he laughed. She turned back to the stove. The timer went off. The rice was exactly right. In March, 7 months after she'd boarded a flight at JFK with one carry-on and the kind of tired that goes all the way down, Nadia Fleming sat at a desk in the Shin Global Engineering Division and opened a new file, not a work file, her own. She had spent 3 weeks talking to the attorney, 2 more in conversation with Zara, who approached the situation with the ferocity of someone who had watched her best friend lose everything and was not prepared to watch it happen twice, and several evenings with Wooseok, not asking for his help. She had been clear about that, but thinking out loud with someone who listened without trying to solve her. The conclusion she reached was her own. The attorney had laid out the path. Nadia had chosen to walk it. She was filing, not to destroy Brennan. She had no interest in destruction, which took energy she'd rather spend building. She was filing to reclaim authorship, to put her name on what she had made. The legal process would be slow and imperfect and worth it, and Zara had already lined up 2 people she trusted to help when the time came. But that was later. Right now, there was the new file. Clean architecture. Nothing borrowed. Nothing echoing Brennan's version. Hers from the first line. The way the original had always been hers from the first line. Different implementation, evolved thinking, 4 years of additional experience in her hands. She had been 23 when she wrote the first version. She was 31 now. She was better. She wrote for 2 hours. When she stopped, it was not because she'd run out of ideas. It was because her phone lit up with a message from Wooseok. Meeting ran long. Dinner at 8. I'll cook. She looked at the message. She looked at the code on her screen. She had a life here that she was building line by line, the way she built everything. A job that used her completely. A city that was becoming familiar in the way of places you choose rather than places you're assigned. A man who had sat still in the dark for 11 hours so she could rest. Who had removed a threat without making it about his power. Who said, "I want you to have the information," as if her knowing where she stood was simply the minimum courtesy she was owed. And Zara, who had put her on this plane in the first place, who had called her every week without fail, who had already started researching flights to Seoul for the summer because she wanted to see the city that had put the light back in her best friend's voice. She typed back, 8 works. Don't let it burn. His reply came immediately. I have a timer. She smiled. She saved the file. She reached for her coat. The Seoul evening waited outside the glass tower, cold and bright and full of the particular promise of a city still new enough to surprise her. She walked into it. She was 31 years old. She was not starting over. She was starting. There is a difference. She was only now learning its full size. If this story moved you, subscribe so you're here for the next one, and leave a comment below. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything without asking permission? I want to read yours.